Hey guys, it's Rebecca from alltapestrycrochet.com, and this is the 6th video in the Tapestry Crochet for Beginners series. In this video, I'm going to go over the general pattern for doing a round base in one continuous spiral. Bases done in this style are often referred to as Wayuu style bases. As I mentioned in the video on how rounds work, bases of this style are done without joining and chaining one. In other words, they're done in one continuous spiral. This is what a pattern looks like for one of these bases. Completing these bases is actually a lot more simple than it looks. But while the general formula for making a base this way is quite simple, there are a few instances when you have to change the formula up a bit to fit your needs. On these patterns, each dot is a stitch and each circle is a round. So each one of these dots represents a single crochet stitch or a modified single crochet stitch, and each circle in this spiral is a round. The increases are not marked, so you have to decide on your own where you want to put the increases. Later, I'll do a demonstration to help you all have an idea of how to decide where to put the increases. I have 2 videos already where I go step by step through 2 different Wayuu style bases. Normally I wouldn't do something like that where I walk you guys through each step from beginning to end. My hope is that these tutorials will help you guys to reach a point where you understand tapestry crochet enough to be able to take a tapestry crochet chart that I give you and make it into whatever you want without having to think twice. With this topic though, it's a little more complicated because, as I hinted at earlier, there's really no exact formula for how to crochet this type of base. There's a general pattern to follow, but the truth is that for each base, you have to move the stitches around to make it work correctly. I'll explain why that's the case in just a bit. First, let me introduce you to the general formula. It goes like this. First, chain 2. Second, do 8 modified single crochet stitches into the first chain. That's round 1. After you finish round 1, begin round 2 by doing the first increase directly into the next stitch, which is the first stitch of the previous round. In round 2, you'll do 1 increase into each stitch all the way around. That's 8 increases in round 2 for a total of 16 single crochet stitches. From here, each round begins firstly with an increase and then is followed by some number of modified single crochet stitches, and the number of modified single crochet stitches that separate the increases will go up by 1 in each round. So in round 2 there were only increases, therefore there were 0 modified single crochet stitches in between the increases. In round 3 there will be 1 modified single crochet in between increases. So for round 3, begin with 1 increase in the first stitch, then do 1 modified single crochet stitch into the next stitch, and then 1 increase again, and then another modified single crochet stitch, and just continue that all the way around. To summarize, that's 1 increase into the first stitch, 1 modified single crochet into the next stitch, times 8. Therefore, you should have 8 increases and 8 modified single crochet stitches for a total of 24 stitches. So in every round, you're going to have 8 increases. In round 4, you're going to do 1 increase in the first stitch, and then 2 modified single crochets into the next 2 stitches. You would repeat that 8 times around. In the 5th round, do 1 increase and then 3 modified single crochet stitches, and repeat that 8 times all the way around. So you guys get the pattern, right? In each round, the number of modified single crochet stitches that are going to separate the increases will go up by 1. So if you look at this pattern, starting in round 3, each increase is going to be separated by 1 modified single crochet stitch. In round 4, it goes up to 2. Round 5, it goes up to 3. Round 6 goes up to 4. So as you can see, the pattern is actually pretty simple. Before I move on to the demonstration, let me point out a few things that I want you guys to take note of. These bases are typically done using a modified single crochet stitch. However, some patterns will work well with both the modified single crochet and the regular single crochet stitch. The other thing that you should notice about this pattern is that at the end of each round, your total number of stitches will be a multiple of 8. Round 1 has a total of 8 single crochet stitches. Round 2 has a total of 16, round 3, 24, round 4, 32. For any round, if you take the round number and multiply it by 8, it'll give you the total amount of stitches that will be in that round. Knowing this is important because it helps you when it comes to estimating the number of rounds you should do in order to get the right amount of stitches for the pattern for the sides. I know that that's something that people have asked me about a lot, so that is something I'll talk about more in another video. The third thing that I want to mention is that if you want your base to be completely plain, technically you could follow this pattern exactly, but because the increases would be directly on top of each other, it might end up looking more like an octagon. You could still use this pattern, but if you're going to, be sure to move the increases around every so many rows so that it doesn't create an octagonal shape. When doing bases like these though that have designs, you're naturally going to have to move the increases around. Let me go ahead and get that demonstration started now so I can give you an example of why this is the case. For this demonstration, what I decided to do was just go ahead and use one of the step-by-step tutorials that I've already completed and just narrate over it and explain why I'm making the decisions that I made. This first slide here says round 1. Technically, round 1 would just be step 4. That would be the 8 single crochet stitches. The first 3 steps actually represent this dot right here, this first stitch right in the center. So in other words, this dot represents a slip knot and chaining 2. Then this circle right here represents the first 8 single crochet stitches. So round 1 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 single crochet stitches done into the first chain space. There are actually 2 reasons why I say to leave a relatively long tail. The first reason is so that when you complete the first few rounds, you'll be able to crochet over that tail so that it really locks it into place. The second point I'll go over a little bit later. You all know how to create a slip knot and chain 2. Once you've chained 2, you're going to do your first 8 single crochet stitches into this first chain space right here. Now notice as I do these 8 single crochet stitches, it starts to stretch out the first chain space. If you had a short tail, the tail would end up falling out of that first chain space and it would come undone. If you have a nice long tail, you have a lot of space to work with, so it doesn't really matter if it stretches out. You could just go ahead and pull that tail and it'll tighten up the first round. Now round 2 is when you're going to bring in the second color. The reason you want to bring in a second color at this point is so that it'll be available for use in the third round. In this second round here, we're going to be crocheting over the green yarn so that in the third round we could pick it up and use it when the green stitches appear on the pattern. I mentioned in the video on how rounds work when doing tapestry crochet that when doing a base you also have no need to join and chain 1. In other words, you're going to do the first single crochet of this round directly into the first single crochet of the previous round. Once again, that's no joining and no chaining 1. This is why I say that these bases are worked in one continuous spiral. Round 2 is going to be nothing but increases, so you're going to do an increase into each stitch all the way around for a total of 16 single crochet stitches. As you can see, I've already brought in my second color here. When I go to do my first single crochet stitch, it'll lock that yarn into place here. This yarn that I have in my hand here is going to lock this green yarn into place. Notice that I did the first single crochet stitch into the first stitch of the previous round, and I did no joining and no chaining 1. I just completed the first single crochet stitch into that next stitch. And now I'm pulling the tail over so that as I continue to crochet through the round, this tail will get locked into place along with the white tail from the earlier round. Now I complete the second single crochet into the first space. In other words, I'm doing the second half of the increase. For me, when I do the second round, usually the first round will begin to loosen up again. That's just because I apply a lot of tension. You could just go ahead and pull on the tails once again and it'll tighten up that circle. Continue to do an increase into each stitch all the way around and you should come up with a total of 16 single crochet stitches. Now let's move into round 3. At this point we're going to have to decide where we want to put our increases. In round 1 there were no increases, in round 2 there were nothing but increases, so we didn't have to make a decision about where to place the increases. But in round 3 there's going to be an increase separated by a modified single crochet stitch, then another increase, all the way around. So we need to decide which one of these stitches is going to be increase and which is going to be just a regular modified single crochet. On rounds 1 and 2 I was using just a regular single crochet stitch, but from now on I'll be using a modified single crochet. The reason why I used a regular single crochet stitch is because the first 2 rounds are plain, so there's no pattern that has to be done. It won't be affected by whether I use a regular single crochet or a modified single crochet. But starting in round 3, I'm going to start using a modified single crochet stitch so that the pattern comes out correctly. Say that the first 5 rounds were all white. In that case, I wouldn't want to use a regular single crochet stitch for the first 5 rounds because it would be noticeable when you went from using a regular single crochet stitch to a modified single crochet. But because in this case there are only 2 rounds, it won't be that noticeable. For me, on round 3, the decision of where to put the increases was pretty simple. As I mentioned earlier, each round is going to have 8 increases. If you look at this pattern, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these leaf shapes. So I just went ahead and used the bottom of these leaf shapes as the points for the increases. Another reason why I use these points is because using these points would allow the entire increase to be green. Sometimes you may need to switch it up so that the first half of the increase is one color and the second half is another color, but in most cases it'll look best if the increase is made up of only one color. When you do an increase, the 2 individual stitches that make up the increase will be a little bit more tightly packed. If I had an increase starting right here, so the first half of the increase was green and the second half was white, this white strip right here that separates these 2 leaf shapes would be slightly more narrow. So leaving this as a regular modified single crochet stitch helps to make this border in between these 2 leaves a little bit thicker. The first part of round 3 says to do 2 green modified single crochet stitch into the first stitch. So I'm going to use this point right here as the first point of round 3. This stitch and the stitch right next to it will be done into this white stitch below it. Then the second part of round 3 says to do 1 white modified single crochet into the next stitch. So that's this stitch right here, and it'll be done into the stitch underneath it. Then you repeat that all the way around for a total of 24 single crochet stitches, or rather modified single crochet stitches. Now here is the first half of the first increase. It's just a green modified single crochet stitch, and I did the second green modified single crochet stitch into that same space. Now I'm about to switch to white, and I'm going to do that first white modified single crochet into the next space. Now you switch back to green and you just complete that all the way around. Let's move on to round 4. For round 4, we're going to leave the increase at the beginning of the round. I like to leave the increase at the beginning of the round as much as I can just because it's easy to memorize. But there are some times when it works out better to move the increase to another point in the round. For now though, we're going to go ahead and leave it at the beginning. So we'll do 2 green modified single crochet into the first stitch. In other words, we're going to do a green increase into the first stitch. Then we're going to follow that up with 1 green modified single crochet into the next stitch. And finally 1 white modified single crochet into the following stitch. And you'll repeat that pattern all the way around for a total of 32 modified single crochets. Notice how the last stitch that I completed from the previous round was white. In the pattern, this was the first stitch of the previous round, therefore this stitch that meets up with it on the other end of the circle is the last stitch of the round. That matches up with what I have here. So from this point, or this point here on the pattern, we're going to move on to this stitch here. This will be the first stitch of round 4. These 2 stitches make up the first increase, followed by a green modified single crochet, and then a white modified single crochet. Here is the first half of the increase. And here is the second half, in other words, a second single crochet into the same space. Now I'm going to do the green modified single crochet, not an increase, followed by a white modified single crochet into the next stitch. Then I just continue that all the way around for a total of 32 single crochet stitches. So let's skip ahead to round 7. In round 7, the increase will once again be at the beginning of the round. However, it'll be one of those odd increases that are done with the first half of the increase being one color and the second half being another color. In round 7, the first increase is going to be done with the first half being white and the second half being green. So in other words, you're going to do one white modified single crochet into the first stitch, and into the same stitch you're going to do the second single crochet with green instead of white. That will be followed up with 3 green modified single crochets and then 2 white modified single crochets. Let me explain why I did this. In round 3, this was the first increase right here. The following increase was done into the first half of that increase, so these 2 stitches were the first increase of the next round. In the round after that, these 2 stitches were the first increase, and then in the following round, the increase was made up of these 2 stitches. So just to keep the increase at the beginning of the round, I decided to go ahead and make the increase with the first half of it being white and the second half being green. So these 2 stitches right here make up the first increase of round 7. I'm going to go ahead and skip over the actual video of me doing this, and I'm going to move to round 8 because in round 8 is the first time that I move the increase in order to preserve the pattern. In round 8, if you're following the pattern, you might predict that I would start with a white increase, since the increases have been following a straight line. Here was the first increase, here was the second, the third, fourth, fifth. So then naturally you might assume that the 6th would be these 2 white stitches here. But if I did it this way, these 3 stitches would not actually be centered above these 4 stitches here. Imagine that I completed these 2 white stitches as an increase. These 2 stitches would take up this stitch right here. They would be centered over this white stitch. That means that this green stitch would actually be centered over this one would be centered over this one, and this one would be centered over this one. Basically, imagine that each stitch would be shifted over by 1. So this stitch here would turn to green. This would be the first green, second green, third green, and then this white stitch would shift over to here. So you would have the 3 green stitches here. So these 3 stitches would actually become off-centered compared to these 4 green stitches underneath it, and it would no longer be a nice even peak. So what you have is 1 regular modified single crochet, and then another one that will line up right on top of this one. These 2 will be the increase, and they'll be centered above the stitch here. That leaves this stitch to be centered above this one, and then this white stitch here will be centered above this one. So these 3 here will basically take up the space of these 2 down here. Therefore, it'll be nice and centered with these 4 green stitches below it. Normally, when this happens, when you need to move an increase, it won't be apparent until you're actually crocheting. So just by looking at the pattern, you might not necessarily know that having an increase in a certain spot will ruin the pattern. So hopefully if that ends up happening, you can just think back to this video and remember that if you're having a problem with following one of these patterns, most likely the solution is just to move the increases around. I'm going to go ahead and skip forward to round 9. Once again, in round 9, you want to keep this triangle shape going. So in order to do that, you need these 2 stitches to be centered above these 3 stitches here. And the only way to do that is to have these 2 stitches centered above this stitch here. So the first stitch from the previous round was this one right here. The first stitch of round 9 is going to be this one. The pattern calls for 1 white modified single crochet into the next 3 stitches, so that would be this one, and this one, 1, 2, 3. followed by 2 green single crochet stitch into the next stitch. So this white one goes here, this one goes here, this one goes here, and then these 2 green stitches that make up the first increase will go into this stitch right underneath it. Skip ahead to round 10, and once again the increase is now at the beginning of the round. If you remember, this was the first stitch of the previous round. Therefore, these 2 stitches here will be the first increase of round 10. So since these 2 stitches go into this stitch, that means this one goes into this one, and this one goes into this one, and the green stitch will go into this first green stitch here. This green stitch here will be just slanted enough to the left of this stitch that it'll look like it's centered above these 2 stitches here. Because of that, there was no longer a need to do an increase in this area in order to maintain this triangle shape, so I just went ahead and moved the increase to the beginning of the round again just to make it easier to remember. In round 11, once again, there's no problem with having the increase at the beginning of the round. It will not negatively affect the pattern. So the first increase will be here, the second one will be here, third here, fourth, fifth, sixth, 7th, and 8th. Once again, having the increases in these spots will make no difference in the way that the pattern looks. In round 12, however, this is another time when you have to move the increase in order to preserve the look of the design. So in round 11, the increase was right here. If we kept the increase at the beginning of the round, the increase would be made up of half green and half white. As I've mentioned before, when you use an increase, the 2 stitches will be squished a bit. So if this green stitch here was squished, it would mess up the symmetry of this pyramid shape here. So what I did was I just did this first green stitch here as just a regular modified single crochet stitch, and then I moved the increase over one spot. So these 2 white stitches here will be the first increase of round 12. That's why the pattern calls for 1 green modified single crochet stitch into the first stitch, and then 2 white modified single crochet stitches into the next stitch. In round 13, once again, I wanted to maintain this shape. So in round 12, once again, this is going to be the first stitch of the round. Therefore, this will be the first stitch of round 13. So you'll do 1, 2 green single crochet stitches, and then an increase made up of 2 white stitches. See how once again with round 14 here, we have 1, 2, 3 regular green modified single crochet stitches, and then the increase is right here at the beginning of this pyramid shape. With each round, the increases are going to continue to move to a further point in the round. In other words, the number of green single crochet stitches before the increase will continue to go up, but you'll know that the increases will always be the first 2 white stitches of this pyramid shape. What I would recommend to you is that when you get to the point in a base where the pattern is no longer working out, just experiment with moving the increases around a little bit and see what works for your pattern. The only thing that you need to remember is that there need to be 8 increases per round. Exactly where you put those increases really doesn't matter too much. The last thing I want to say before we wrap up this demonstration is that if you're doing a base that's going to be very large, you might find after a certain point that the base starts to bowl up. This happens when there are not enough increases. Using just 8 increases should work for the average base, but if you get to a point where it starts to bowl up, what I would recommend to you is just to start adding more increases. Start with adding an extra 4 increases per round and see if that helps you out. If 4 doesn't work for you, maybe try 6 or 8. Whatever the number is, adding more increases will help to flatten that base out again. Keep in mind though that if you add too many increases, the base can actually start to get wavy. That's why I recommend starting with less and seeing if that works, and if not, then you could try more. I've also heard of people just steam ironing the base to flatten out. A couple of times when I personally have experienced this problem, once I'm done with the base, I just give it a couple stretches here and there and it flattens out and it stays flat. The last thing that I want to say before wrapping up this demonstration is that I get one question quite often about bases, but also just about tapestry crochet in general. The question is, if you have a round or two that only uses one color, should you drop off the extra yarn so that you only have to work with one yarn? The simple answer is no. The reason why I say no is because when you're carrying multiple yarns behind the stitches or underneath the stitches, it creates a certain height and thickness to those stitches. So if you drop off that extra yarn and you're only working with one yarn to do your single crochet stitches, it'll drastically affect the height and the thickness of that round. So you'll have one round that is significantly thinner than the other rounds. That's pretty much all that I have to say for this demonstration, guys. Now, I know that this is one of those concepts that's really hard to grasp, and trust me, guys, it's really hard to explain. But honestly, this is one of those things that when you jump in, you realize it's not as hard as it seems. I think just knowing that where you put the increases actually matters will help you guys be able to complete any pattern. Because if you're working on a pattern and it starts to get messed up and it stops working out, now you know that most likely the problem is just that you need to move the increase to another spot. But yeah, guys, that's really pretty much it. So let's go ahead and end this tutorial. I know this is one of those more complex aspects of tapestry crochet, so if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. You can also message me directly on the All Tapestry Crochet Facebook page, or you could look for answers in one of the many free tutorials on alltapestrycrochet.com. I wish the very best of luck to you all, and happy crocheting!